Foreign Minister Zardari, thank you so much for joining Bloomberg Television.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start out with these devastating floods. This entire summer we saw across Pakistan, 1,600 people have died, at least. This is $30 billion of damage. You were here in the United States. You got another $10 million on top of the $56 million. What more do you need from international partners?
As far as the floods are concerned, they're absolutely of an apocalyptic biblical proportion. As you mentioned, 1,600 people dead, a third of which are children. 33 million people affected, again, 16 million of which are children. 600,000 pregnant women, homeless, ready to give birth. Under the night sky. The assistance, which we're very grateful for, from not only the United States, but all over the world so far, has been in response to our UN flash appeal for $160 million to assist us in the relief and rescue phase. Going forward, as the water recedes, we're working on our damage needs assessment, and then we'll be in a better place to give a final figure of the damage and what needs to be done going forward. As you mentioned, the initial sort of guesstimates we're seeing is $30 billion of damage.
When you met with Secretary Blinken, he came out after and he said Pakistan should also be engaging with China when it comes to debt relief. Part of that is also following the floods, a lot of money the country is going to need to recoup from this. Do you get a sense from this administration or administrations past that there is this push and pull of how much Pakistan should be engaging with China?
So Pakistan has, throughout our history, engaged with not only the United States, but also with China. As far as debt relief is concerned, at the moment, as I said, we're talking about our rescue and relief operations. And going forward, once we have a proper damage needs assessment done, we will be having a broader conversation with all our partners about restructuring our debt, or sort of conversations around debt. But my conversations, whatever my conversations with China, those will be between Pakistan and China, I think it's best left that way.
You're also waiting on some funds, you and a number of developed countries, of $100 billion from these countries that have the money to try to help, in terms of you're dealing with these climate disasters, and they also want you to build back in a cleaner way. What is the status of these funds, especially as we go into the COP talks in Egypt?
I think it's a fantastic question. So having gone through these devastating floods and having heard for the past some time now about how serious the developed world wants us to get about climate, and how the $100 billion to be collected annually to tackle climate change, we assumed that there'd be such funds available to help deal with this, a disaster of this scale. But it turns out that no, unfortunately, we have not been able to live up to our commitment, or at least developed countries have not been able to live up to their commitment of the $100 billion annually, and developing countries such as mine are sort of taking the brunt of the climate catastrophe. Our output, sort of in terms of carbon, is 0.8% of the carbon footprint, and we're the 8th most climate-stressed country on the planet. So that's surely not only ironical, it's incredibly unfair. As the UN Secretary General has said, this is not a question of charity. This is a question of climate justice, and I do look forward to engaging in a conversation about climate justice with our friends at COP27.
Not only on the front lines of climate change, but also what's going on in the world with global inflation. Inflation in Pakistan is north of 27%. We see a surge in energy prices. Europe now is taking in a lot of cargoes that would have maybe gone to developed countries like Pakistan. You have dealt with blackouts in the past. How concerned are you about the price of energy and potentially rolling blackouts this winter?
So we were already worried about the price of energy. We were already worried about food insecurity, and we were already in a difficult economic situation, although we were clawing our way back. Following the floods, we're incredibly concerned about all these things. As far as food security is concerned, we had 4 million acres of crop devastated from the floods, and we used to import a lot of our wheat from the Ukraine. So as a result of that conflict over there, and now being compounded by this disaster, there's serious questions about food insecurity. Energy has always been an issue, but you're absolutely right. We've had a disruption in supply chains. The sanctions hasn't helped, and it's made it difficult for poor countries such as with Pakistan to be able to ensure energy security.
And your prime minister said you will have discussions with Russia on energy and on wheat. But so far, any deals?
So we have had discussions about wheat with Russia, but I don't believe that any of our orders have come through.
I also want to ask you about Afghanistan. You said this week that you think the United States should unfreeze the Afghan central bank funds. How does the U.S. do that in the sense that the Taliban is running a country with draconian social measures, especially when it comes to women and girls, and also what many would say is housing or at least offering a safe refuge for terrorists? How do you think they can unfreeze those funds in the eyes of the international community?
I'm incredibly passionate about women's education and women's rights, particularly in the Islamic world. My mother was the first female prime minister in the Muslim world. This is a very personal question to me. I get offended when people say that women in Islam don't have rights. I contend that no, Islam gave rights to women well before a lot of today's developed world had attained rights for women. But I realistically want to achieve that. And I believe unless we engage with Afghanistan, unless there is a level of economic stability, we will see a contraction of rights of women and girls in Afghanistan rather than an expansion of rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. And this is something that we've seen throughout history, that theocratic, autocratic regimes have always, at times of economic strife and economic difficulty, clutched onto cultural issues, taken away rights rather than expanded rights from their citizens. I mean, when the citizens of Rome were hungry, they put on a gladiator show. And what I'm worried about is in our pursuit to punish them to achieve our goals, we may not be being counterproductive. And we may already be seeing a contraction of rights for women and girls in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And I don't want us to descend into the situation that we saw in the 1990s with amputations, with flogging, et cetera, et cetera. As far as the central bank is concerned, whatever you think of the government of Afghanistan, whether they should be there, not be there, the question is, if they are now, their estate, these funds were unilaterally seized and frozen, and that's exacerbated the economic situation over there. It's definitely not helped. There's been some movement as far as making an Afghan fund, but I think it'd be best if we could route these funds through the Afghan central bank. Obviously, there should be checks and balances. Obviously, I agree there should be a technocrat and a banker rather than a theologian in charge of a bank. But let's work towards that and not punish the women and the people of Afghanistan because we don't like who's in charge.
Should the funds not be used, though, so the international community can exert pressure for the Taliban to change some of these policies, say girls not going to school after the 6th grade? So
I don't actually think it's a particularly successful or humane policy to starve the people of Afghanistan to try and get them to convince them to have girls access education. I think this is a topic that the Muslim world should take up themselves, and we are taking ourselves with the Afghan government, that Islam grants women the right to education, well, everyone a right to an education. And while they say that there's, primary school for girls in a way that there wasn't before, this tertiary education for women, although segregated as it wasn't before, we will continue to push them on secondary education for women. But I, for one, would prefer if we delinked the overall economic situation with rights for women and girls in Afghanistan.